The air in the Pacific Northwest always had a specific weight to it before a storm, a heavy, damp pressure that made the lungs work a little harder, like the atmosphere itself was holding its breath. I was in my sanctuary, a detached 3-car garage that I'd converted into a high-end workshop. It was lined with industrial shelving, organized by torque specs and fluid types, smelling of high-grade motor oil and cold steel. I was elbow-deep in the exposed gut of a 1969 Norton Commando, my fingers slick with a cocktail of grease and gasoline, when the world outside my sanctuary turned into a violent kaleidoscope of red and blue. The strobe lights reflecting off the polished chrome of my tools were rhythmic and aggressive. For a moment, I stayed under the bike, the wrench frozen in my hand, thinking maybe a neighbor had a medical emergency. But then the heavy crunch of gravel under combat boots told me otherwise. I wiped my hands on a blackened rag, the fabric rough against my skin, and stepped out into the driveway. The rain was just starting to mist, turning the pavement into a slick mirror that caught the pulsing emergency lights. Elias Vance? The officer standing by the cruiser was young, dangerously young. His uniform was crisp, his duty belt jingling with every shift of his weight, and his posture radiated that volatile mix of adrenaline and the moral superiority of a man who thinks he's just cornered a monster. "That's me," I said, squinting against the glare. "Is something wrong, officer? Is there a fire?" "Mr. Vance, you're under arrest for felony child endangerment, hit-and-run neglect, and reckless abandonment." I stared at him, the rag still in my hand. For a split second, my brain searched for a rational explanation. Maybe it was a prank, some twisted retirement send-off from the boys at the engineering firm. Or maybe a dream. But the weight of the rain on my shoulders was too real. "You've got the wrong house, officer," I said, my voice steady but dropping an octave into that tone I used when a contractor tried to skip on safety specs. "I don't have children. I haven't had so much as a speeding ticket in a decade. I live alone." His partner, a graying sergeant with eyes that looked like they'd seen the bottom of every bleak bottle in the city, stepped forward into the light. He looked at me not with anger but with a weary, professional disgust. "We have a 3-year-old boy in the back of a midnight blue Audi A6 at the Northgate Transit Center," the sergeant said, his voice flat. The windows were up. The engine was off. The interior temperature was clocked at 112 degrees. "The child is currently unresponsive and in critical condition at Harborview. The vehicle is registered to you, Elias Vance, at this exact address." The name of the car hit me like a physical blow to the solar plexus. The Audi. My old A6. The car I'd surrendered 24 months ago during the scorched earth divorce from Julianne. I'd bought that car for her 35th birthday, a symbol of a marriage I thought was built on the same structural integrity as the skyscrapers I designed. It turned out the foundations were made of sand, and that car was the first brick in a wall of lies that had been surrounding me for years. "I sold that car to my ex-wife Julianne Thorne 2 years ago," I said, the words feeling like dry cotton in my mouth. "It was part of the final asset division. I have the notarized bill of sale and the transfer documents in my office, right through that door. I haven't touched that steering wheel since the day I moved out." "The state database hasn't been updated in 2 years, Mr. Vance," the younger officer snapped, stepping closer, his hand hovering near his holster. "As far as the state of Washington is concerned, that is your vehicle, that is your registration, and that child's life is your liability." Before I could even process the legal nightmare unfolding, the younger officer spun me around. The cold, mechanical clack of the handcuffs was a sound that didn't belong in my driveway. It was a sound for the people I used to read about in the papers, not for a man who spent his weekends restoring vintage bikes and his weekdays calculating load-bearing stress. As they led me to the cruiser, I caught a glimpse of my reflection in the side view mirror, a 50-year-old man, a respected forensic engineer, being hauled away in his work shirt like a common predator. "Where is she?" I asked, my face pressed against the cold plastic partition of the back seat as we pulled away. "Where is Julianne?" If the car was at the transit center, she had to be there. "Units are sweeping the shopping mall adjacent to the center," the sergeant replied without looking back. "We'll find her. But right now you're the one on the paperwork." The precinct smelled of industrial floor wax, stale coffee, and the pervasive scent of human desperation. They didn't put me in a holding cell, they put me in an interrogation room, a box of cinder blocks and humming fluorescent lights that vibrated at a frequency designed to grate on the nerves. I sat there for hours. My mind was a whirlwind of structural analysis, trying to find the flaw in the last 2 years of my life. I thought about Julianne, my wife of 15 years. The woman who had systematically dismantled our life together by sleeping with a junior partner at her architectural firm. The woman who had stood in front of a judge and cried about how my emotional distance had driven her to seek warmth elsewhere. She had taken half of my 401k, the Audi, and a hefty settlement, leaving me with a bitter silence in a house that felt too big. Then the door to the interrogation room was left slightly ajar. From the hallway I heard it, the sound of a woman crying. But it wasn't the sound of a mother in grief. It was the specific, sharp, performative sob that Julianne used when she was trying to manipulate a situation. It was a sound I knew in my marrow. I watched through the crack in the door as they led her past. She was in handcuffs, her expensive blonde highlights tangled, her designer heels clicking frantically on the linoleum. She held a Nordstrom shopping bag in her cuffed hands like it was a holy relic. When her eyes caught mine through the glass, they didn't fill with the guilt of a mother who'd almost killed her son. They filled with a terrifying, tactical calculation. "Elias," she shrieked, her voice cutting through the precinct chatter like a serrated blade. "Why didn't you fix the registration? I told you to handle the DMV. This is your fault. You wanted this to happen. You left the car in your name just to spite me." The sheer, breathtaking audacity of the lie left me momentarily paralyzed. She was standing there, having left a 3-year-old child, her child, the product of the affair that ended our marriage, in a sweltering metal tomb while she hunted for a bargain, and her first instinct was to pivot the blade toward me. Detective Sarah Chin, a woman with a face like a flint axe and eyes that saw through every layer of bureaucratic nonsense, entered the room and sat down. She didn't look like she was in the mood for Julianne's drama. She opened a thick file and laid out several photos. "Mr. Vance, let's talk about Marcus Jr., she said. "The doctors say his core temperature was 105 when the paramedics got there. He's in a medically induced coma." "He's not my son, detective," I said, my voice sounding like gravel under a boot. "Julianne had an affair with her boss, Marcus Brennan. That boy was born 6 months after our divorce was finalized. I have the DNA waivers and the non-paternity acknowledgments signed by a judge. I have zero legal, biological, or emotional ties to that child." Detective Chin didn't look surprised. She tapped a pen against a printout. "The car, however, is a different story. According to the city's traffic cams, this Audi has been involved in 3 toll bridge violations and 2 red light skips in the last 18 months. Each time the summons was sent to your address. You never responded, which led to a bench warrant for the registered owner. Why didn't you report the fraud then?" "Because I never received those summons," I said, the cold realization finally settling in. "I still own a small duplex near our old marital home. I haven't lived there in years, but I used it as a secondary mailing address for my bike parts." Julianne must have known. She must have been intercepting the mail, or she forged a change of address form with the postal service. "It's deeper than that, Elias," Chin said, leaning in. "When we ran your social security number in relation to the vehicle arrest, we found a ghost profile. Did you know you are currently the primary leaseholder for a penthouse in the Pearl District? Or that you have an outstanding $30,000 line of credit at a high-end furniture wholesaler?" I felt the room start to spin. The investigator's chill, I usually felt at work, was replaced by a raw, burning fury. "I haven't opened a new account in years. I pay for everything in cash or through a single business card. Your ex-wife didn't just keep the car in your name to save on registration fees," Chin explained, her voice dropping to a professional whisper. "She's been living as Mrs. Elias Vance for the last 24 months whenever it suited her. She forged your signature on the BMW and Audi title renewals to keep the executive platinum insurance rates you've had for decades. She used your impeccable employment history and structural engineering credentials to bypass credit checks for a life she and Marcus Sr. couldn't afford on their own. The betrayal wasn't just a crack in the foundation. It was a total structural failure. Julianne hadn't just moved on, she had harvested my identity to build a golden cage for her and her lover, leaving me to pay for the bars." 2 hours later, my attorney, a man named Harrison who specialized in the kind of high-stakes litigation that usually involved collapsing bridges, arrived. He didn't come alone. He brought a digital archive, the black box of our divorce. He spread out the documents on the interrogation table like a deck of winning cards. "My client followed every legal protocol," Harrison told Detective Chin. "We have the signed transfer of interest. We have the text thread from August of last year where Ms. Thorne explicitly stated, 'I've handled the DMV paperwork, stop harassing me.' It turns out she was lying to maintain a fraudulent insurance policy under my client's name. I was released that night, but as I walked out of the precinct, the nightmare was only beginning. The local news crews were already there, their cameras like hungry eyes in the dark. A reporter with a microphone and a breaking news expression shoved her way to the front. "Mr. Vance, how do you respond to the claims that you sabotaged your ex-wife's car registration to frame her for neglect?" I didn't answer. I couldn't. I got into my truck, the interior smelling of wood smoke and old leather, and drove home in a daze. My phone was a graveyard of notifications. The neighborhood watch group was already calling me a monster. My boss had left a message that was even worse. "Elias, the board has seen the headlines. For the sake of the firm's public image, we're placing you on indefinite administrative leave. We'll discuss a severance package once the criminal charges are resolved." I sat in my dark kitchen, the only sound the ticking of the clock and the rain against the glass. Julianne had managed to turn her own horrific negligence into my social and professional execution. She had left a child to die, and somehow the world was looking at me. But as I stared at the divorce papers on my table, I felt a shift in my internal architecture. I wasn't just a victim. I was a forensic engineer. I was the guy people called when they wanted to know exactly why a building fell down. I knew how to find the one bolt, the one weak weld, the one hidden flaw that would bring a whole structure screaming to the ground. Julianne thought she was the master of chaos. She thought she could use my name as a shield for her sins. But she'd forgotten that when you live in a house made of lies, you shouldn't invite an engineer to inspect the foundations. I picked up the phone and called Harrison. "Don't just file the defense. I want a private investigator on Marcus Sr. I want a deep dive audit on every account Julianne has touched since the day we split. If she wants to live as my wife, she's going to learn exactly how I handle a breach of contract." The storm finally broke outside, a flash of lightning illuminating the yard. The first part of the game was hers. But the audit was just beginning. The transition from respected professional to social pariah happened with a speed that would have fascinated me if it weren't so devastating. Within 48 hours of my release from the precinct, my life had been stripped down to the studs. My email was a barrage of "we're going in a different direction" messages from long-term clients. My gym membership was under review after a complaint from an anonymous member. Even the local coffee shop where I'd been a fixture for a decade felt cold, the barista looking everywhere but at my eyes. Julianne had done her job well. She had leveraged her tears into a media campaign, appearing on the local morning news with a carefully curated look of shattered motherhood. She spoke about the difficulties of co-parenting with a man obsessed with control, and how the registration mix-up was just another way I was trying to keep her under my thumb. But while she was busy playing to the cameras, I was back in my garage, which had been transformed from a workshop into a war room. I didn't just hire a private investigator. I hired a digital ghost named Leo, a man I'd helped years ago when an engineering firm tried to frame him for a server breach. Leo didn't care about the news. He cared about data. "Elias," Leo said over an encrypted line, his voice a gravelly hum. "Your ex-wife isn't just a liar. She's a parasite. I've cracked the encrypted partition on that shared cloud account. You're going to want to sit down for this. She didn't just steal your credit, she stole your legacy." I sat at my workbench, the glare of 3 monitors reflected in my safety glasses. What Leo showed me was a masterpiece of domestic espionage. Julianne had been using an old, forgotten business account I'd set up for my consultancy back in 2018. Since the account was linked to my high-limit commercial line of credit, she had been treating it like an infinite fountain of cash. But it wasn't just the money. It was the scorn. Leo pulled up a series of voice memos Julianne had recorded on her phone, notes for her journal, or perhaps just a way to vent her arrogance. "Elias is so predictable," her voice echoed through my garage speakers, sounding tinny and surreal. "He thinks he's so smart because he can calculate the wind load on a skyscraper, but he can't even see that I'm paying for my new life with Marcus using his own sweat. He's a ghost. A boring, dutiful ghost who deserves to be haunted." I felt a cold, sharp clarity settle over me. In engineering, when a structure fails, you don't blame the gravity, you blame the architect who ignored the stress loads. I had been too trusting, too dutiful. I had allowed her to become a load-bearing wall in my life without checking the quality of the materials. "Leo," I said, my voice as cold as the steel frame of the Norton bike beside me. "I want everything. I want the timestamps of every time she logged into that account. I want the GPS data from the Audi for the last 6 months. And I want the financial records for Marcus Brennan Sr. I have a feeling the architectural partner isn't as successful as he pretends to be." As Leo worked the digital side, I did the physical legwork. I spent my administrative leave conducting a forensic audit of my own property. I visited the duplex near our old home. The mailbox was a treasure trove. Inside were 3 months of intercepted mail, toll violations, insurance adjustment notices, and, most importantly, a letter from a private medical clinic addressed to me. I opened it. It was an invoice for a pediatric consultation and DNA analysis for Marcus Jr. Julianne had used my health insurance, which I'd kept her on for 6 months post-divorce as a gesture of goodwill, to pay for the test that proved her lover was the father. She had quite literally made me pay for the proof of her betrayal. But as I dug deeper into Marcus Sr.'s life, the structural flaws became gaping holes. Marcus wasn't a partner at the firm. He was a senior associate on the verge of being fired for embezzling client funds to cover his gambling debts. Julianne hadn't left me for a better man. She had jumped from a stable bridge onto a sinking ship, and she was using my identity as a life jacket. By Friday, the child, little Marcus Jr., had regained consciousness. The news portrayed it as a miracle, and Julianne was there clutching a teddy bear for the cameras. But behind the scenes, Child Protective Services was starting to see the cracks. The emergency I had been arrested for was now being re-evaluated. I called a meeting in my lawyer Harrison's office. I didn't just want a defense, I wanted a total demolition. "Harrison," I said, laying the documents on his mahogany table. "We're not just filing for defamation. We're filing for racketeer-influenced and corrupt organizations RICO Act violations at a domestic level." She didn't work alone. Marcus Sr. helped her forge the signatures. They conspired to use my credit to secure their apartment and their cars. It's a criminal enterprise. Harrison looked at the evidence: the voice memos, the intercepted mail, the insurance fraud. A slow, predatory smile spread across his face. "Elias, you're not just an engineer. You're a goddamn wrecking ball. When do we hit?" "Tuesday," I said. "The day of her custody and restitution hearing. She's expecting to walk out of there a victim. I want her to walk out in a jumpsuit." The weekend was the longest of my life. I spent it in the garage finishing the Norton Commando. There was something meditative about the assembly, the way every bolt had to be perfectly torqued, every wire perfectly routed. It was the opposite of the life Julianne had built. On Monday night, Leo sent the final piece of the puzzle. "Elias, I found the kill switch." Julianne didn't just shop for shoes at the plaza. She was meeting someone. I have the dashcam footage from a car parked 3 spots down. She wasn't distracted by shopping. She was in a heated argument with Marcus Sr. about the embezzled money. She left the kid in the car as a weapon, a way to cut the argument short and force Marcus to leave. She hadn't forgotten the child. She had used him as a pawn in a power struggle with her lover. Tuesday morning arrived with a gray, oppressive sky. I dressed in my best charcoal suit, the one I wore for city council presentations. I didn't look like a man under investigation. I looked like the man who owned the building. The courthouse was a circus. Julianne arrived with her high-priced media attorney, a man who looked like he'd been carved out of a block of pomade. She spotted me in the hallway and did a double take. Her eyes flickered with a brief, jagged flash of fear, but she quickly masked it with a look of wounded dignity. "Elias," she said, her voice loud enough for the nearby reporters to hear. "I hope you're here to finally take responsibility for the registration mess. My son almost died because of your negligence." I didn't say a word. I simply looked at her, not with anger, but with the clinical detachment I'd use on a cracked foundation. I turned and walked into the courtroom. The hearing began with the usual bureaucratic droning. Julianne's lawyer stood up and gave a moving speech about the trials of a single mother, and how the malicious inaction of the ex-husband had led to a near tragedy. He asked for the immediate dismissal of any neglect charges against Julianne and a massive increase in the restitution I owed her from the divorce settlement. The judge, a no-nonsense woman named Vance, looked at Harrison. "Mr. Vance, does your client have anything to say before I rule on the motion to dismiss?" Harrison stood up. He didn't look at the judge, he looked at the court stenographer. "Your Honor, we don't just have a statement. We have a forensic audit of a criminal conspiracy." For the next hour, the courtroom was a theater of the absurd. Harrison played the voice memos. He showed the dashcam footage of the argument in the parking lot. He presented the intercepted mail and the forged signatures on the insurance documents. But the final blow was the financial trail. Harrison showed how the money Julianne had stolen from my accounts had been funneled into Marcus Sr.'s embezzlement repayment fund. She wasn't just a cheat, she was an accomplice. The silence in the room was absolute. Even the reporters had stopped typing. Julianne's face went from pale to a sickly, translucent green. She looked at Marcus Sr., who was sitting in the back of the room. He was already halfway to the door. "Wait." Julianne shrieked, jumping to her feet. That data was stolen. He hacked me. This is an invasion of privacy. Judge Vance hammered her gavel with a sound like a gunshot. Sit down, Miss Thorne. Privacy is the least of your concerns right now. The judge turned to the bailiffs. I am denying the motion to dismiss. Furthermore, based on the evidence of identity theft, document forgery, and potential criminal conspiracy, I am referring this matter to the district attorney's office for immediate prosecution. Miss Thorne, you are to be remanded into custody pending a bail hearing. The sound of the handcuffs clicking this time was different. It wasn't in a rainy driveway, it was in a court of law. As they led Julianne away, she looked at me, truly looked at me for the first time in 3 years. She didn't see a boring ghost. She saw the man who had just dismantled her entire world with the precision of a surgeon. You're a monster, Elias, she screamed as she was pulled through the double doors. You destroyed me. No, Julianne, I said softly, though I knew she couldn't hear me. I just performed a safety inspection. And you failed. As I walked out of the courthouse, the reporters were no longer shoving microphones in my face. They were standing back, giving me room. The narrative had flipped. The villain was gone, and in his place was a man who had survived a collapse. But the audit wasn't over. There was still the matter of Marcus Sr., the stolen $40,000, and the final demolition of Julianne's executive life. I got on my Norton Commando, which I'd parked in the front of the courthouse. The engine roared to life, a perfect, tuned vibration that hummed through my bones. I put it in gear and rode away, leaving the chaos behind. The foundation was clear. Now it was time to build. The aftermath of the courtroom revelation felt like the silence after a controlled implosion. The dust was still settling, but the structure of Julianne's life had already pancaked into the basement. While she sat in a county lockup, unable to post the $250,000 bail set by a judge who was clearly disgusted by the dashcam footage, I was busy completing the final phase of the audit. The 17 counts weren't just a number to me, they were 17 distinct acts of war. Each one represented a moment where Julianne had sat at a computer or signed a document, intentionally erasing my identity to fuel her own. I spent the next 2 weeks working alongside Detective Chen and my digital specialist, Leo. We weren't just looking for fraud anymore, we were looking for the deep architecture. Elias, look at this, Leo said, pointing to a series of encrypted transfers. She didn't just use your credit for the apartment. She opened a secondary business account under Vance Engineering, a shell company she registered in a neighboring state using your forged credentials. She was using it to take consulting deposits from small firms that thought they were hiring you. My heart hammered against my ribs. This was the ultimate betrayal. She wasn't just stealing my money, she was selling my reputation, my 40 years of expertise, as a product she could hawk for quick cash. She had signed 3 contracts for structural inspections she never performed, taking $10,000 retainers for each. If those buildings failed, it wouldn't be Julianne in the crosshairs, it would be my license, my career, and my freedom. We have the IP addresses, Elias, Chen said, stepping into the room with a fresh stack of warrants. They all trace back to the penthouse she shared with Marcus Sr. And we found the notary she was using, a cousin of Marcus who was in on the kickbacks. He's already singing to avoid a racketeering charge. The noose was tightening. The final criminal trial took place 6 months later. By then, the public narrative had undergone a total reversal. The local news that had once labeled me a monster was now running long-form segments on the Vance identity theft case, using it as a cautionary tale for high-net-worth individuals going through a divorce. The courtroom was packed. My former boss, Jim, was there in the front row, looking like he wanted to apologize but didn't know how to start. Mrs. Patterson, my neighbor who had once avoided my gaze, sat 2 rows back, clutching a handkerchief. Julianne was brought in wearing a drab orange jumpsuit. The blonde highlights were gone, replaced by flat, mousy roots. The designer heels had been swapped for standard-issue rubber slip-ons. She didn't look like a master of chaos anymore, she looked like a structural defect, something small and broken that had been found out by a thorough inspection. The prosecution was relentless. They laid out the 17 counts like a row of falling dominoes. The Audi registration fraud. 3 counts of credit card identity theft. The forged apartment lease. 5 counts of insurance fraud. 4 counts of commercial wire fraud, the consulting shell company. And finally, the felony child endangerment. When Detective Chen took the stand, she played the final piece of evidence, a recording from the Audi's own black box telematics. It captured the audio inside the car during the hour Julianne was in Nordstrom. The sound of little Leo crying, calling for his mother, while the temperature sensors in the car's log showed the heat climbing from 90 to 110 degrees, was unbearable. Several jurors wept. Even the court reporter had to look away. But the most damning part was the audio from 45 minutes in. Julianne had accidentally triggered the car's remote start app on her phone, which activated the internal mic. You could hear her voice, distant but clear, talking to Marcus Sr. on her Apple Watch. "He's fine, Marcus. He's asleep. If I come out now, I lose the discount. Just tell your boss the money is coming. Elias is paying for it, he just doesn't know it yet." The jury didn't even need an hour. "Guilty on all counts," the foreman announced. The judge didn't show an ounce of leniency. "Miss Thorne, you treated other people's lives, including your own son's, as currency for your own vanity. You systematically attempted to destroy a man who had provided for you for 15 years. You are sentenced to 12 years in a state correctional facility, followed by 10 years of intensive parole." As the bailiffs moved in, Julianne turned to me. She didn't scream this time. Her voice was a ragged whisper. "You always had to be right, Elias. You always had to have everything in its perfect place. I hope you're happy in your perfect, lonely world." I stood up, buttoning my blazer. "It's not lonely, Julianne," I said, my voice echoing in the silent court. "It's just stable. Something you wouldn't understand." The aftermath was a slow process of reconstruction. The court ordered total restitution, $85,000 from her grandmother's inheritance that we had successfully frozen, plus the seizure of her remaining assets to cover my legal fees and the $40,000 in fraudulent debts. 6 months after the sentencing, I received a phone call from an unfamiliar number. "Mr. Vance? This is Marcus Sr." My grip tightened on the phone. "You're lucky you aren't in a cell next to her, Marcus. The only reason the DA didn't charge you was because you turned state's evidence." "I know." His voice was shaky, humbled. "I'm calling because, well, I wanted to tell you that Leo is doing great. We've moved to Montana. I'm working in a warehouse, nothing fancy. I'm out of the architect game. I just wanted to say, I'm sorry. I knew she was using your name for the car. I should have said something. You should have been a father, Marcus. That's all that mattered. I'm trying now. He's 5. He's healthy. He asks about the man who helped the police. I told him you were a good man. Goodbye, Elias." I hung up and looked out at my driveway. The Norton Commando was finished, gleaming in the soft afternoon sun. My reputation at the firm had been more than restored. They had offered me a senior partnership and a seat on the board. I had turned them down. I didn't want to manage people anymore. I wanted to build. I sold the big house with the heavy memories. I bought a smaller place, a modern glass and steel cabin on the edge of a cliff overlooking the Sound. It was a marvel of engineering built on solid rock with foundations that went 40 feet deep. On my moving day, I found an old, tattered rag in a box, the same one I'd used to wipe the grease from my hands the night the police arrived. I started to throw it away, but then I stopped. I kept it. It was a reminder that even the cleanest lives can get messy, and that the only way to survive a collapse is to be the one who knows how to read the blueprints. I climbed onto the Norton, kicked the starter, and felt the engine roar to life, a perfect, balanced machine. I rode away from the old life, into a future that was finally structurally sound. The audit was over. The building was standing. And for the first time in my life, the air felt light.